Welcome to the bass workshop. I'm glad you all are here. We're going to play a song first, and then we'll talk about what happens. Let's do that turn on. One, two, one. tune from Ornette Coleman, featuring in that day Charlie Hayden on the contrabass.
Fue un tema de Ornette Coleman, que bueno, en ese momento tocó el contrabajo
Ornette Coleman,
de bass,
Charlie Hayden.
Charlie Hayden. Bueno, primero, bienvenidos a todos. Esto es un workshop que vamos a hacer, es una parte de lo que es la segunda edición de la Ruta del Jazz, es una serie de conciertos didácticos y workshops este año. Así que, bueno, estamos súper agradecidos. Tenemos a Daryl Taylor, que es un bajista norteamericano viviendo en Berlín, y que, bueno, ha tocado con todo el mundo en Estados Unidos, Houston, Texas, y ahora está por unos días en Fuerteventura para que, bueno, solamente esa pequeña introducción.
That particular song we're going to talk about later with styles of jazz and improvisation, but that Ornette Coleman in the 60s turned the jazz world upside down because they didn't have a chord instrument. They only used melodic instruments.
Bueno, esta canción después se va a hablar un poco de lo que es improvisación, pero esta composición en los 60 hizo Ornette Coleman, si lo conocen, es un saxofonista que empezó con mucho de la historia del free jazz. Bueno, lo que tiene en particular dio vuelta, cambió lo que era el jazz, en el sentido que empezó a tocar con un grupo donde no había acompañamiento armónico.
And we'll talk about that part later. The outline of what we're doing today, we're going to do a little bit of history of the bass.
Vamos a hablar un poco de la historia del bajo.
We'll do the role of the bass in music.
El rol del bajo en la música.
Traditional pop jazz.
Tradicional pop jazz.
I know some of you guys are classical. I'm not so familiar with classical.
Sí, que algunos de ustedes son
A
clásicos.
little bit. We'll touch on it a little.
Perdón, necesito traducido a las dos.
And then improvisation.
Y bueno, y después finalmente improvisación. Jazz.
Yeah? So let's go with terminology. Bass. Bass. What is that? What is that? What's happening?
Igual no hace falta traducción. Todo el mundo habla inglés, ¿entiendes?
They're in the wrong one.
Si hay uno solo que necesita. Okay. Okay, well, just if you don't understand anything, you can just ask, it will be quicker. Perdón, si no tienen algo, preguntan y va a ser más rápido. No sé, por favor, si hay uno solo que necesita.
What happened?
No, if you need translation and notes, we are discussing about that.
No, pero si hay algo que no entendemos, algo te preguntamos.
Perfecto. Puedo responder.
Okay, so with the terminology we have sopranos, the high end of the music, tones. We have altos, of course, contraltos or mezzos, but we just go to bass. Cello colleague earlier, in classical music, the cello was considered bass for a lot of composers, but then came this bigger one, and they called it the underbass, meaning it was under the cellos. And so I guess another way you could call it the double bass or the contrabass, because it's underneath the cellos, who are normally considered bass. Yeah? So that's the words. So even it started, the first one started around in the 16th century, that's 1500, 620. And that was the first bass violin. And they were, it was no standard way to do it, you know. I mean, violins, everybody knows the violins, and then violas, and then cello. And then they started making basses around 1520, like that. But they were some were bigger and some were smaller. It wasn't a standard for a while, you know. and then classical composers were writing concertos and music operas with this underbass going on, and that's when it started. The first person who was considered a virtuoso, how you say that? Domenico Dragonetti. We all know him, right? He was considered Italian. You can tell the name. He's Italian, and he was considered the first virtuoso on the bass. He was just brilliant. He was a star of the bass, and they only had 3 strings in those days. By the way, it was only 3 strings, but he still was considered just an absolute virtuoso. He traveled from his hometown. He went to Vienna. He was the Russian czars trying to get him to come to Russia. He was just a big star, and he was the first rock star of the bass on 3 strings. It's like amazing to me to think about that, And yeah, okay. Other than that, from that point, the bass progressed to small bands that we call jazz bands. This is where we're going to get into improvisation. But the smaller bands were, in the beginning, they used the tuba or the sousaphone for the bass notes. But then, of course, some ingenious person said, hey, I can play my bass violin in this small group. The problem was that they didn't have amplification, so you had to really play hard to sound over all these horns that are typically in a band. So that's the reason it developed so slowly, because it's easier to get a tuba to play those loud notes with all the other horn players,
Thank you.
So, but eventually it worked, they made large basses and big strong guys. You could actually really play and be heard loud enough so that the bass violin or contrabass started to come into small bands. And that's when, as we started getting into what is jazz, and which is also improvisation. But so that's a little bit of the history. What we really at the same time, we can talk about the role of the bass, which is normally always the root of whatever the chordal structure of the harmonies are that's in the music. Sometimes the whole orchestra will play a big chord, and the bassists and cellos are going to play the lowest notes, and that's considered the roots. Or very creative composers will put the bass in higher tones to make chords really beautiful. That's a part of the harmonies. But the normal function of bass is to play the bottoms of the chords, the roots, to really let everything understand where it is. You also have that with horns. You have baritone saxes. There's one right there, in fact. That's a baritone saxophone. And it typically plays the lowest notes that the saxophone guys are all going to play. So, it kind of functions like a bass. They have bass saxophones, right? That's bigger than that. Yeah, they're bigger than that. That's the traditional role of the bass. And then as we come into the very first ones came in the late 40s, we started to get into bass guitar. And once we got into the early 50s, this guy in California named Leo Fender made the first mass-produced bass guitar. And that's another idea. This is a violin, but that's a guitar. And they're really different instruments, but the role and the function is the same. Of course, the technique of how to play it is different, but for the most part, how it moves and how it works in a band or an orchestra is the same. And because of all those horn players I talked about who play so loud before, a lot of bass violin players ended up getting the bass guitar and just plugging it into an amplifier, and then you could hear it very well in those big bands back in the day. That started happening in the late 50s, 57, 58. They started to using bass guitar. But then at the same time, a company called Ampeg started to making pickups and amplifiers for the double bass or the contrabass bass violin at the same time. So then early players in these big bands started to using that. And then that way you could hear the bass violin very well in itself, more than the bass guitar. So so he could keep his function of playing the lowest tones in the bands. Another aspect of the function or the role of the bass is keeping time, especially when you start talking about these jazz, we call them big bands, that's like a section of saxophones, a section of trombones, a section of trumpets. So that's trombones are alto, baritone-ish basses. Like trumpets are always going to be high. We know those guys, and loud. That's why they put them in the back. and the saxophones are typically in the front, playing all these beautiful harmonies and melodies. And then off to the side is the rhythm section. And that's typically going to be a drummer, a contrabassist, sometimes bass guitar, and a pianist. And that's what we call a big band or a jazz big band. We had luminaries like Count Basie, Duke Ellington, what are those other guys who had all of the big bands in those days. And that was pop music at the time. People were dancing to that music as though it was popular music at the time. And they all had this type of setup, horns and a rhythm section. And the bass kept time in that time. You outline the chords with rhythms. So that's going to be typically just like we can play a little bit. Like just a little, the same thing, kind of like just a C blues, but just like 1, 2, 3. So you can see how I was marking the time. 1, 2, 3, 6, 7, 8, 1. And also, I'm marking the chord we play. It's the walking bass pattern. And of course, in the earliest days, it was very slow and a lot of fun. Who was it? Louis Armstrong, coming out of New Orleans, was one of the earliest. But you don't do it by yourself, so you can show like those early guys, Jerry Roll Martin and what's his name, that famous guy. So you can see how he played that. Yeah, a brilliant player. But you see when he was, as he was moving all of the parts around, that's typically how they played. And once Louis Armstrong started his bands, he had the clarinet and the saxophone and the trombone to play all of those little parts that he was doing. But so they did group improvisations like. So while the melody was going, everybody just joined in, and this is really the beginning of jazz improvisations in a lot of ways. It was kind of like a group improvisation thing. They called it Dixieland jazz, the early Louis Armstrong stuff, and he's coming out of New Orleans, and that's kind of what they call jazz. In fact, the word was, of course, because classical people didn't regard jazz as being real music. Sometimes they still don't. Yeah. But no, even the top schools in America, the Juilliard School of Music, everybody, all the top schools of music now have a jazz department. But years ago, Juilliard had no jazz department. You could not study jazz at Juilliard. That's one of the top music schools in America. But now you can. So now they've softened their stance a bit.
So there was no.
I didn't say that. I didn't say that. But they did consider that. So what they called it is, those guys are just jazzing around. That's just jazzing around. They're not really playing. They're just jazzing around. Because they were improvising. This is the thing. Because classical musicians don't always improvise. No. I know. I met a couple of very relatively famous concert pianists that was at a school I was studying at, a creative music studio in Hamburg, over in New York City, but in Woodstock, New York. But the music director was from Hamburg. And of course, he had studied classical, but his thing was improvisation, free improvisation as far as they were concerned. And I met a pianist, and she told me, she said, if you sit me in front of a piano with no music, I can't play. I can't play anything, And that, for me, was amazing because I had never grown up in that world, So I thought you could always just play something. She said, I can't. She said, I can now because I've been working on that, so I can actually play things. When about 7, 8 years ago, she said I couldn't play anything without music in front of me playing. So this is the thing. So that's improvisation, and that's why the classical people thought the Louis Armstrong and his people were just jazzing around, which is where the word comes from, because that is the terminology. So it's really about improvisation. You just making up a melody and harmonies on the spot. They just come from your mind. I looked up the word today. The definition says without a plan or without a plan, but that's really not true. In jazz improvisations, what the herald of free improvisation or avant-garde, like out front, the advanced guard, the guys out front. And they really didn't have any structure. They only had a melody. And everything else, in rhythm, but everything else was completely free. And I got a chance to work with those guys a bit, study with them. And Arnett explained that it's what he called harmonics. So that's harmony and melody mixed together. So what it means is if a person plays a melody, then the other musicians will make something harmonize. They will harmonize with that melody. Or if these people play a harmony, then the improviser will make a melody that goes with the harmony. So they're constantly making that happen. And it's very unique when you hear it. During the time I'm kind of jumping around in the timeline, but in New York City, around the 60s, when they first came to New York City, everybody had been playing what we would call, we just did ragtime, and that's what we were speaking about. But after that, you would go to what? Bebop, I suppose. And we should maybe play an example of a bebop song. What you think? What about
Okay.
Oh wait, you was just playing that, right? Oh, sorry, you was just doing that. Let's do. I didn't think about it. Just something we can do. Scrapple from the album. Okay. Something like that. I'm improvising now, right? 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. You see how the melody was low, but that's considered bebop music, which is and the bass was really just walking along behind him, keeping time and marking out the chords, making sure he was playing he was playing the chords that would fit with the melody. This is that function. And okay. As we move a little forward, we'll get into what was considered, and the typical thing is into the next big chord. And there's few chords. We could play something like so what, and I'm skipping around, but that will fit with where we are now. Yeah. 1, 2, 1. You see, we played that whole melody of the song with just 2 chords. And all of the improvisation you heard Lionel especially doing. I mean, I was trying, but you saw how Lionel was doing. He's using various substitutions of chords and various scales and modes. That's why we call it modal jazz. He's using different modes to create different pathways and areas for him to do his improvisation. This is what we call modal jazz. Whereas as I said, bebop was before that, a lot of chords, a lot of different chords, and you had to negotiate every time you had to negotiate a different chord, which is also brilliantly genius, absolutely. But modal jazz gave you fewer chords, but more freedom to express how you wanted to go. Now, and that was, once that was really popular in the early 60s, in the early to the middle 60s, that's when these guys, Ornette Coleman, came onto the scene playing what they call free jazz, where they didn't do any of that. They just played this melody and they just played whatever they felt like playing. But they had, of course, had been working together for a very long time, so they really played well together. But it just sounded like nothing that anybody had heard before, because that was, like I said, no chords. That was just open, and the melody and the rhythms and the bass, especially Charlie Hayden. He's a genius at connecting the places that the improvisation person or the improviser would go. He connected it to the places they had been and the places that they wanted to go. And it's just amazing when you hear it. I would maybe I could even play a little bit of it for you a little bit later. But that's the improvisational aspects of the bass, especially, and how we were functioning in jazz music. You know. So at this point, I will just kind of stop talking because I've been kind of wearing myself out. And probably you guys too. And if you have any questions, just let me know. We're going to talk some more. We're going to have some more. We're going to demonstrate some more things. But do you have any questions?
It was bebop on this song.
If it was the last one, was
Last
bebop.
That's considered modal jazz or modern, and people also call it modern jazz because it only had two chords. It's called So What. It was by Miles Davis. I'm sorry, it's by Miles Davis. The bassist was Paul Chambers, who was like one of the real stars of the jazz movements. He played especially the bebop jazz, and he even played this modal jazz because he was just so technically good. Yeah, he studied classical when he was younger. He's from Detroit, and he went to a technical high school, and he really studied. He had excellent bow technique. I think he uses German bow, and just a brilliant bassist and one of my absolute favorites in jazz. But yeah, he played a lot with the Miles Davis group. He played all of the bebop stuff. But those songs were the doorways that started us into what was called modern jazz, and he was there as a bass player. Paul Chambers, but once we got into the modern jazz era, yeah, he played a lot of that as well because he just was so good. But that was another chapter, and there were other bassists that continued that role, especially from John Coltrane, Reggie Workman, and Jimmy Garrison. These guys were really the main guys that carried that torch from where you didn't have a lot of chords, or the chords were just not clearly defined. They had chords, but even like, for example, John Coltrane played what is That's an example of what I mean. Like, they took songs that had a lot of chords in them, but he just reharmonized it so that there weren't very many chords. You know, he had his band to not play so many chords because it gave him a lot of freedom to just play however he wanted, and then he kind of played everywhere. He took it to outer space sometimes. And these are the this is the aspect of jazz as we started to moving into what we call avant-garde or free jazz, you know. But the improvisation is you know, pretty much the same. They just based it off of scales and modalities, the modes of scales. What we got. And we know. Okay, then once we get into the harmony parts of improvisation, you know what exactly we're talking about. We have. My first teacher taught me the major scale. We all know that. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do. You know that, right? Do, re. Everybody knows that. So, of course, if you started, it's the same notes, you just started with the second note. I'm sorry, I have to say deep because you guys, I know you call it something else. I'm sorry. What you say? The Dorian, yeah, that's what we call it. That's the Dorian scale. And it starts on the second note. What Ray? Start on Ray. Huh?
In Spanish.
There you go. So in every note in that scale, if you started and you play it the same notes to the octave, that's a different mode. You know? And this is what jazz improvisers use to really get creative. And they even changed that. That's just one aspect of it. That's still like that play bass. Christian McBride is one. Dave Holland is one. There's so many that are well-known jazz bassists who are great improvisers and even band leaders and composers. You know, so that's where we are as we've come up to today. I just jumped around a lot. I hope you could follow me. If you have any questions, let me know.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I have a basic question.
Yeah.
What about the groove of the, I don't know how to say in English, but I'm sometimes playing with bass players, and some players like you have like something, groove, you know, but I mean, even with the drums, but with the bass, I find it's much more important for some reason.
You mean,
I think you practice in the early years, something like that, you know, to have this, you know?
You mean with jazz or with
With
we
whatever
start getting
is
into more
beyond the style.
more electrical stuff?
No, it's the way to play, you know, it could be, the feeling is in jazz or whatever, the swing, I don't know how to say in English.
Okay, well, yeah, I did some, you know, at that school I was mentioning, I got a chance to study a little bit with Jack DeJohnette, and he talked to us about timing. And I don't know, y'all know this movie? Y'all know this movie called Doom? Anybody know Doom as a movie? Can you maybe interpret that? Y'all don't know this movie? Doom. It's from this guy named Frank. You know that. She knows. It's in Doom. They're on this planet, and they have this drug that everybody likes to use. It's kind of almost sounds a little bit like some of these powder drugs that people like, and they make a lot of money with it. But in this drug comes from these worms that crawl around underneath the planet. And what happens is if you walk with rhythm like this, the worm will come. So what the guys who lived on the planet learned how to do is just walk in a funny rhythm. They wouldn't walk in a straight rhythm. Now, I use that as an example because as what he was talking about with the groove, if you walk with straight rhythms with very symmetrical timing, like absolutely, something happens that's kind of magical in music. It really is. If you get really symmetrical in music, I mean, I know some of the people who are here who might know, like from the Cubans and from the, Santeria and that kind of stuff. This thing happens that we call the groove, and it's nice. It makes people want to get up and start dancing and everything. You know how some music just makes you want to get up and move, and some music, very good music. You think about it. Because it's so complex, and there are a lot of intricate things happening. And as I didn't explain this part as we move into scales and chords, they have also an effect on your emotions. You know this, though. You know this. You can play a certain chord and it's going to have a nicer feeling to it, or a certain chord that's a bit, daunting, or and then like the major chord with a seven, just straight, See, it's like you play a minor chord. You see, and then a dominant, a seven. Well, typically, I like that, and so this is the parts that happen. So with groove, depending on the chord you're using, it just makes you get up and move. When those rhythms are very symmetrical and even and straight, it gives a feeling that just makes you just want to dance. It just makes you want to get up and just start dancing. Some music, like I said, it makes you just feel it and you think about it. But some music, the groove stuff, you want to move. You want to move your body because it just hits your body when those rhythms. That's a little different from sounds or the notes and harmonies, rhythms and harmony. But the rhythms is the groove part.
No, but because sometimes I feel you're playing walking, and I feel sometimes that is my perception. It's like the walking could be a bit behind the beat.
Yeah.
I remember once I got a class with Michael Brecker, and he talked a lot about it. Okay, we can play a bit in front, after front, or behind,
right
or
on
in
it,
the
or
outside.
behind.
But will you mix it with swing on
I kind of mix it, yeah. I kind of mix it. It just depends on the feeling I'm feeling, But that's what Jack DeJohnette taught us, the same thing.
Yeah.
He says he says there's a beat circle, and some people play on let's say if this is going forward.
Yeah.
Some people play on the forward part of the beat. He said never go outside of the beat circle. But you can play on this forward edge of the beat circle, He said, like Tony Williams is the classic example of playing really on top of the beat, almost anticipating.
Yeah.
He said, some people are going to play right in the middle. He said, that's more like Elvin Jones, right in the middle of those beats, And some people, he said, play almost on the back part of the beat.
Right.
Maybe, yeah. So he gave us that kind of example. Yeah, it just went out to California. That's when he started doing that, the birth of the cool. Because in California it's nice and it's easy, it's not so edgy. So, that's an example of how different cities have a pulse. It has a feeling that, but with the groove part, yeah. Sometimes I do play on top, I anticipate, almost going like your role. You keep one foot in the rhythms and one foot in the harmonies, so you always have to, make these two things happen, like all the time. That's the way it works, with the bass. That's the main function and role of bass, in our music, yeah.
I have a question.
Yes. What's your question?
What about the emotions in the modes? Before you just made an example of the emotions in the chords. And what about the emotions in the modes?
The modes?
Yeah. Like, do you have also kind of?
Well, they are included because the main ones within the modes, you're gonna have like the major one. That first chord he played, that's the Ionian. That's the of the major scale chord. That's the number one, Ionian. And the second and the sixth one are variations of what is the minor. And he played that. And that minor one is a little dark. It wants to move. It wants to go to another chord. You can use it. It can stay on its own, but it gives the feeling emotionally like it really wants to go somewhere else. Those are the modes, And because you can, just like if I'm speaking and if I say, then it sounds like I'm gonna start to say something else, But if I say something and then I say, that's just, I'm finished, I'm back kind of home, And so when you're improvising, this is what you're doing, But sometimes it's what do you call it? Tension and release, Some chords give you that tension, and then when you release, when you get back to those home notes, that's the release, I hope I answered that for you. Or maybe I can defer you to my resident, just chord master, because he's really the master at that.
C major chords.
It's major. You see how it's settled? Last chord. See that last chord felt like, okay, now we're in a stable place. That's what we'll say. Enrique, you have a question?
Yes. What a minute. About solos and bass, because I think a bass player, it's like a very, every instrument has like a psychological stuff, And I met a lot of bass players that was waiting their turn to make their solos. And there is some with bass players, they don't like to do solos, And I think okay, if you want to be a soloist, bass, it's cool to have a bass solo, but I prefer to have a good bassist, than someone who can play
solo that much, because. But as Marie, our producer, asked me to make sure I mentioned because she knows one of my favorite bassists was Stanley Clark, and Stanley Clark literally took the bass and made it like a he made it a triumphant instrument. He, as a accompaniment, where you normally just accompanying other people and especially solo. The trumpets are always solo, and then the saxophone. They just solo. That's naturally a solo instrument. The pianists, they have it all. They have it all. They accompany and they solo. They have everything, But like trumpets and those guys, that's just a natural soloistic instrument. Whereas the bass, our primary role is accompaniment, So a lot of bass players, I think that's why, they don't really, they just don't really do it that much. Or if they did it, they just started doing it later, and especially once you started getting into jazz. That's what for me. Until I got into jazz, I didn't really solo. I mean, that was a couple of tunes that was on the scene where, in soul music or something where there was a nice bass solo, but only one or two songs, that was it. But in the world of jazz, and a friend of mine said, man, you should listen to Stanley Clark. And I was like, yeah. And let me listen to him, and I was like, oh, okay. Like Dragonetti. He took bass solo into he's like a big star with it, on the bass guitar and the country bass and with the vocals. Of course, he studied classical, and he can really play every style, So he just took it to the next level. And that was a big inspiration for me to start to study improvisation, especially because he really was nailing it. And you can't just do it. You have to work at it. I mean, it's called, that's why I looked up the term, and basically the term said without preparation or something. I'm like, no, you can't, not in music, you can't say the definition of improvisation is without preparation, because you have to prepare, you have to. You study all of those modes, you study different scales. Those modes come from, that's almost, 7 different notes, that's 7 different modes that come from one scale, but jazz musicians play 7, 8, 10 different scales. And every one of those scales, all of those notes will have, a different feeling to them, So it just gives you a whole world of possibilities when you want to solo. It's because we all know that do, re, mi, fa, sol. That's a nice basic to start from, because we've been hearing that forever. That's just been etched in our mind. So that's a very good part to start from. But if you really want to study improvisation, especially like jazz musicians, you just got to get into it, and then you're going to step away from that major scale, go into with improvisation, and especially on bass. But that's on any instrument, including the drum. He's going to do the same thing with rhythms. You just, once you get into just one of the easiest songs to play with a melody. So as a bassist, you can play this, no problem. No problem. Yeah. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. That was the whole melody over a blues form, but it was just basically one note. Well, 2 notes. This is the 5th degree of the major scale, and then the octave. So it's in C. that's a melody that any bass player can play. You know, like you said, a lot of times basses, we don't grow up playing melodies and solos, but that's a great place to start because it's just so easy, you know, to play. You know, any questions? Yeah. So yeah, that one you guys can do. Another bass melody, I should play it on that one. I was about to start with this bass guitar stuff. You know, sometimes I wasn't exactly sure what my audience would be, so I wasn't sure how to prepare, but we went to I was at a class and one kid brought his bass guitar and he had an AC/DC shirt on, you know, so I was like, oh, I know the type of music he's gonna play. But
¿Preguntas tiene alguno? Solamente por el poder.
she's gonna demonstrate her prowess on the television. He's so you know, and but that's the simple stuff because you know I never know who my students are or what they might be into doing. I'm gonna play one more song right quick, where that's a really famous bass melody. Mr. PC.
Yeah.
Stay.
I'll be back. The really good ones. I mean, I'm aspiring to be a really, really good one. But those guys are just legendary guys, man. And they're like rock players, man. And they just, you know, they anchor those groups. Well, even Ron Carter says, I'm not an anchor of any band. I'm not the anchor. I don't hold the band in one place, you know. So never. He doesn't like you to use that term to describe his bass playing. Sometimes people say, yeah, he's anchoring the band. He's like, no. I don't anchor this band anywhere. An anchor, you guys, I know everybody knows this word anchor, right? It holds the ship in one place. And they use this term sometimes to describe a bass player because we hold the bottom of the chord. That's the main thing. But they call these guys an anchor because, I don't know. But someone say, no, don't use that term because basses just float around. They move. If the chord goes here, they go there as well. They go wherever the chord goes or the band goes. So Ron Carter was famous for saying, no, never call me that. But yeah, but Paul Chambers that was his song. Okay, we're gonna have a cellist here. As I was saying before, oh, that's that Yamaha silence.
Yes, sir.
Who's your, yeah, that's right. You have to see. Come. Yeah. Caravan for us, ladies and gentlemen. Give her a hand. This is a very famous classic song. As I mentioned, Duke Ellington was one of those guys who had those big bands. A couple of other names I wanted was Tommy Dorsey. And what was his brother? Tommy and Charlie Dorsey. They also had big bands, lots of those guys. And this was a very famous song from Duke Ellington called Caravan. And the desert. Like, we have a lot of times people play it like Latin. No. We're in the desert. That's different. North Africa. There you go. And then we play like a scale expression. See that feeling? Yeah, we call it the Spanish scale. We call it the frequency. You see these folks get down the field. Yeah, you see, that's the cello.
Well, you know, it's difficult to find out what exactly could be the function for the cello in jazz. You can play low, kind of accompaniment.
Yeah.
You can play a melody.
I only have 7 notes lower than you. Only 7.
Yeah.
Only 7. Everything else, she's got it. But those 7. But yeah, okay. I think we're getting toward the end of our little session here. Anybody got more questions?
¿Alguna pregunta de ahí?
I know y'all got questions.
Are there some modes that are used more often than others in modern jazz?
I'm sorry.
Are there some modes that are used more often than others in modern jazz?
Ideas.
Modes. There are some
Oh, modes.
In modern jazz.
are used more often.
Yeah, it just depends on how,
In modern jazz.
in modern jazz.
In model.
Modal jazz.
I would say, what, I think it's like the suspended minor chord. I was talking about the chord trend.
Yeah, they, of course, it depends. Like the early songs we played, So What, was, that's typical. They were more in the, what would be the going out of that major scale. But what happens is John Coltrane used those same chords when he did Impressions.
Yeah.
And because he was really known for really being like out, and that was some of the doorways he used to go out as far as avant-garde, free expression music. He used some, you start with different, you don't even start with that major scale. You can use this melodic minor scale. I should have brought my list of all these different scales that these guys use. But there are a lot of different scales you can use. You can just have to, do some research. But they don't even use that, well, it depends. Some musicians do use it because it's nice. All of them give you a feeling, an emotional feeling. So it just depends on how they feel and what they want to express. But as I said, the beginning of that So What was one of the early things, and they were really in that major scale modal family, I can call it. But when Coltrane did Impressions, he started stepping really outside of that family of the major scale. He was using all kinds of different scales. He's all over the place, Just check it out on YouTube. All of that music is there. So What and Impressions, if you can remember that. Those two especially. And you'll get a good idea about the difference in how people were using, what modes and what scales they were using. But typically the Dorian minor scale, and you can vary that using the Aeolian minor scale. It's a little darker than the Dorian. And it's just what she's just doing. I call it Phrygian, Lionel called it, some people call it the Spanish scale. Spanish Phrygian. Just that starts. You see, they see harmonic. Well, not harmonic minor. Yeah, that's what I mean. They really be outside of the major scale family. They start to being in another place. Yeah, those Ingersoll books really. You see.
El Omnibus de Charlie Parker. Hay otra transcripción de solos de él, tiene como un chart. Y si no, las primeras versiones de Eversole, creo que el 1, el 2, I think the number 1 and 2 or 3 from Eversole have a lot of, tiene un montón de súper sistematizada esa la información de los modos.
Eversole has everybody. He starts with the basics and just goes all the way to the free. Yeah. No, really, I'm serious. It's really like that. He must have over 100 books with Jamie Abersole. And he really shows you the modes and the chords. And he lists, he's going to give you 4 or 5 songs that you can work that stuff out in with that. In these particular books that he'll have. And they're always small, they're not that big because just one book to cover one thing, one book to cover one thing like that. And like he said, with Charlie Parker, that's 3 books. but they're small. And then I've seen Herbie Hancock books. I've seen books from all of them, but yeah, I have a few, yeah.
Can I tell you? No sé si lo conocen, Jamie Abersold era un saxofonista que hizo muchos libros de todos los autores con las pistas. Entonces uno tiene las pistas para practicar y puede ponerle del lado derecho, sacarle el bajo, o del lado izquierdo le sacas el piano. Entonces así todos los instrumentistas pueden probar. Y los libros generalmente traen las canciones, por ejemplo, un libro de Herbie Hancock. Y tiene las canciones más conocidas de Hancock o los modos por acorde. Entonces está muy gráfico y que viene la grabación. Tiene como 200.
Pero tiene teoría. ¿Te explica cosas?
Los primeros tienen más teoría, pero generalmente theory, most of Jamie Abersold have some theory at the beginning. They explain.
Yeah, he explains everything. Yeah, he explains it all. Just great books. A lot of people.
Jamie Abersold. Jamie Abersold.
Yeah, he's got at least 100 books, maybe at least 100.
200, I guess.
200.
Still alive?
Huh?
Still alive? Jamie Abersold.
I don't know. No, I don't think so. I don't think so. But man, yeah, that's a big thing. When you really want to get into that stuff, that really is, and everything else, even the bebop stuff. He explains all the bebop and mobile, and even going into the freestyle. He works all of that out for you. I'm still learning myself. I'm never got it.
It's good to have some point where to start investigating.
You have to. It's just it's a lifelong quest to just learn as much as you can about all of it. I mean, if that depends on your passion, if you really feel like that about it, yeah, just go for it. Yeah. Any more questions?
¿Alguna pregunta más?
¿Va a tocar en algún lado?
Sí, ahora lo digo. If we are going to play. Esto es parte de un ciclo que se llama Ruta del Jazz y son varios conciertos didácticos y conciertos por toda la isla. Así que para los que quieran, hay unos programas ahí. El del 30 se va a cambiar de lugar, no va a ser en Costa Calma, pero el resto de los conciertos siguen y se van a agregar algunos más.
¿Mañana era el Majadito?
Mañana es un concierto didáctico en Morro Hable, en la estación de guaguas. Y el sábado va a ser en Betancuria, en el de los pueblos bonitos, en la Plaza Santa María de Betancuria. Sí. Y en el norte creo que vamos a hacer por ahora solamente uno en Majanicho, al lado de Majanicho, de Rodrigo Mare, que tenemos el escenario ahí que nos prestan. Sí. Y bueno, y va a haber varios. Pero llévense algunos flyers, hay algunos volantes, y tienen los QRs también, y lo pueden buscar ahí. Porque se van a agregar 2 o 3 fechas más, hasta el 1 de julio que termina todo. Daryl, I don't know if you want to...
No, I think no more questions.
¿Alguna pregunta más? ¿O se termina?
Toca.
One more last question.
Yeah? Okay. We finished. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for... Hopefully, maybe you be inspired to play the bass, or at least have an appreciation for listening to the bass.
Muchas gracias Daryl. Anton Miranda en batería, perdón. Así que, bueno, vamos a estar tocando quinteto con Tomás Figueroa en la guitarra, así que sigan los conciertos y todo esto. Muchísimas gracias por venir, súper agradecidos. Esperamos que les sirva de algo. Y bueno, ayer dio la clase en Live. Lamentablemente no pudimos hacer el streaming online como lo estamos haciendo ahora. Pero bueno, así que pueden seguir los conciertos y más que bienvenidos. Para todo lo que subió a tocar que ahí lo vi,